Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another lecture. We're getting through it. Now we're at the first week of March classes. Actually, it's the second week. So hopefully you're all still chugging along. This week is a little shorter, I think, than the last couple of weeks. Don't have as many slides, so hopefully that'll make it easier to get through. You've got this recording, the plastic problem documentary, and one article about neoliberal environmentalism. So hopefully you can get through all of that and you're enjoying it. I find this stuff a little bit more interesting than some of the earlier stuff, so hopefully you do as well. So the aims of this lecture are to examine the detrimental impact of negative flows on the environment, to understand the driving forces of environmental problems, to explain the global nature of the problems, especially climate change, and the relationship between environmental damage and societal collapse, and to articulate a variety of global responses in addressing global environmental problems. So starting off, we're talking about environmental destruction. So global environmental flows, including the accumulation of greenhouse gases and global warming, these can all pose the most significant threat to the world today. So while some politicians and corporations, especially gas and oil companies, are encouraging skepticism of global climate change, the scientific consensus is indicating that the world is indeed getting warmer and that it's caused by humans. So this lecture is going to be reviewing these kind of global threats, the science behind them, and potential global solutions. So while the environment is inherently global, we all share the same atmosphere. We're all warmed by the sun. We're all connected by the oceans. The earliest thinking on globalization tended to kind of ignore the environment or at least kind of underplay its significance. There was some early concern for the environmental impact of the fallout of nuclear testing and acid rain. However, in about the 1980s and 1990s, the environmental movement made a lot of good progress and a number of noble they noted a lot of problems, especially the depletion of the ozone layer and climate change. Um, so these kind of brought around the environment to kind of being in the forefront as a global issue and problem as well. And in the case of these two issues and the others that we're going to talk about, it's clear that many throughout the world kind of play a major role in the creation of these problems, and that pretty much everybody in the world is going to suffer from any kind of adverse consequences that come around because of them. And so, in that sense, they are clearly global in nature. However, while the idea that environmental problems are global problems seems to be kind of indisputable, it can and has been challenged in various ways. Not everyone or every part of the world is equally responsible for the more pressing global environmental problems, and it's clear that those from the most developed countries are disproportionately responsible from them. But these problems do not and will not affect everyone in all areas of the world in the same way. So, for example, the rise of the level of the seas as a result of global climate change is going to affect those who live on the coastal areas or on islands. And globally, this is going to be poorer people and people of color. Such areas are going to be affected to kind of be expedited in this severity, especially in the context of hurricanes. Tornadoes are expected to increase, although those are going to be different geographical areas like the American Midwest. Another example, those in the north are going to be able to find better ways of dealing or avoiding with a lot of the problems, especially the catastrophic ones, while those in the south will be less able to cope with these. They'll be less, more defenseless, and they'll have fewer options. So, for example, if you lived on the coast of BC, you're likely probably, well off enough, you're affluent enough that you're able to pick up and move into a different part of the province. If something was going to be threatening your house, you could sell the house and leave. And even if you couldn't sell the house because everybody knew it was going to be underwater, nobody wanted to buy the house, you would have enough substance and affluence to be able to move into a different part without having, the benefit of gaining money on your house selling. Whereas people who can't sell their homes, um, they don't have the money, they don't even have the infrastructure for it. Um, they're going to be suffering more at the hands of these environmental problems. And the main sources of these environmental problems change. For example, the center of manufacturing. For example, moving it from US to China. And so there's kind of this dispute over how nations of the world should be responding to these environmental problems, especially climate change, given that there's been nations that are contributing unequally to climate change, such as the global north, contributing more, and that its effects are felt unevenly. So you see that with the global south suffering higher burdens because of climate change. And so it raises a lot of important questions for what constitutes environmental justice overall. So in our third class, we discussed processes that are related to and predate globalization, especially colonialism, imperialism, and development. And so these processes are were all part of a long process of modernization that would have a slow but accelerating effect on the natural environment. And these beginnings of this transition unfolded in this way. So the indigenous practices and forms of knowledge that preceded colonization were, on the whole, or if not always, sustainable. Um, Often they were really ecologically restrained and they had successfully managed productive landscapes for millennia. And these people, the cultures, and the landscapes were disrupted and most often destroyed by new, harsh, exploitative colonial resource regimes that were usually insensitive to the environments that they were imposing upon. So with colonialism and imperialism came this kind of new intensified form of resource extraction. And this fueled early wealth accumulation and the new industrial powers of Europe and then the United States and Canada. And so these new ports and cities were built for trade within Europe's newly industrialized centers. And people moved from rural areas to the cities and populations grew, which all fueled demand for and kept resources flowing from all of the colonies. So colonialism and imperialism as these economic systems also coincided with the period of the Enlightenment and all of these new ways of thinking about the world. So the Enlightenment, for example, introduced this notion of human progress as evolutionary and linear. And with human progress likened to the evolution of the natural world, it built up this idea that we had to kind of keep progressing. The second idea introduced by Enlightenment was this great value that was placed on new technological innovation. So within ships, guns, new medicines, industrial machinery, all of these new inventions, the people that had them came to kind of afford this importance to their scientific and technological advancements. And third, you had Europeans who came to believe that their own morale and racial superiority existed. So then they were asserting their culture, and it was said that it should dominate um, the people of color in the world. So they were seen as inferior, and therefore they needed the superior, air quotes around inferior and superior, of course. Um, they needed to impose their ways of living on other people because that was the best way to live for them, at least. That's what they thought in their brains. And fourth, you also had progress that was tied to this anthropocentric worldview. So humans were seen as the center of the natural order of the world, and then that comes to inevitably dominate and subjugate the non-human world. So we were thinking that we were the be all end all, and nothing else was important except for us. So these practices and ideas that came to be known as modernization, or the supposedly evolutionary process that moved humankind from agriculture and pre-modern societies into this more modern era. And this was brought about by wide-scale rational planning. And so driven by this notion of modernization, this industrialized um, ability to grow, nations started applying their scientific and technical knowledge to economic expansion, cultural domination, and intensifying this exploitation of the earth. So during this time, there was no conception that humans were negatively impacting the environment or that the environment couldn't absorb all of the demands that humans were placing on it. Um, if anything, the natural environment existed explicitly for the betterment of humans because we were, the center. So this long, slow, early phase of modernization would ultimately give way to contemporary globalization, and that would rapidly accelerate and intensify modernization and its environmental impacts. And so this process quickened after World War II as all of these international trades were being increased and more countries were integrated into the global capitalist economy. And we had mass production that was becoming more efficient, and there was more ability to buy things, more ability to consume things. So this mass consumption was going on in the US, in Canada, and in Western Europe. And it just increased the goods because, supply and demand. If you demand something, that the supply is going to have to increase. So that's what it did. We increased. And so these goods that had always been built to be durable and long lasting, they were becoming more part of a disposable consumer society. Um, and although there's been further technological developments, people have still been making all sorts of new chemicals and applying them to agriculture, to war, and to consumer goods. And there was little consideration about how these processes were affecting the environment, um, until the publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in 1962. So Carson's book focused on this, especially the unintended effects of the chemical revolution that had been taking place since the 1940s. And it criticized people's attempt to exploit the earth for their own gain, without having any kind of thought for what's going to happen to the earth while they were doing it. So when the book was published, it was translated into 22 different languages and it was an international phenomenon. And so it came out at the same time as these new scientific studies that had an ecological framework, which also noted the limits of economic growth, and basically what we can do to the environment before it comes completely irrecoverable. So this environmental movement started being, put together. So it brought attention to the implication of resource extraction, energy consumption, industrial production, population growth, and mass consumerism. And several problems started being associated with these human activities, especially talking about global climate change, this loss of biodiversity and overpopulation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But given that these problems were a result of this globalizing industrial activity, these environmentalists began to demand curbs on economic globalization so that they could kind of stop the process of all of this. And so those groups view economic globalization as leading to more manufacturing, which increases pollution. And as a result, this kind of limits the you had to put limits on the trade there, and it curbs this human-made chemicals that have become so commonplace in industrial production. And so there was this movement away from non-renewable resources, from making stuff that's just going to fall apart, save to buy more later. And environmentalists are also very critical of this mass consumerism that drives the demand for cheaper and cheaper goods. So if you have to pay more for something, but it's going to last you longer, that's better for the environment. But people don't have the money or want to pay for more expensive items. So that brings up this difficulty between what the capitalists can sell to the consumers and what the consumers are willing to buy. And so we get to this point where it's like, well, we might as well just stick with cheaper and then other people will buy them. However, all of this environmental movement also sparked its own opposition, especially among the neoliberals. So in the third class, we talked about neoliberalism in great deal. And we have, again, other parts of this semester as well. So the neoliberal perspective here views free trade as central to economic globalization, and it leads to this view that the efforts that are favored by environmentalists to limit industrial pollution are just kind of impeding on free trade and they need to be opposed. So, if efforts to reduce pollution are implemented, they need to be kind of watered down, and eventually eliminated. So, in effect, environmentalists offer this alternative method of globalization to that of neoliberals. So, to environmentalists, the environmental issues are not only global in nature, but they should also be accorded priority over economic considerations. But neoliberalism doesn't really jive with that very well. They want to be able to, do whatever they can, have a free market, have nobody imposing anything on them. So when you say you should consider something more important than economic considerations, neoliberalists kind of go, hey, that's not how I think about it. So these paradigms are very clearly opposed to one another, and there are efforts to create models that integrate the two, so that there's a balance between them, because that's really all we can do. Nobody's going to be able to take one side or the other completely. So one example of this is ecological economics. So that this kind of thought argues that productive economic activity must consider the ecological carrying capacity of the earth. So neoliberal economists view the environmental resources as commodities that need to be bought and sold, and they prioritize economic production over any other environmental concerns, as we've said. And so this is, kind of disregarding any of the environmental limits that have been pushed into efficient but sustainable production. On the other hand, ecological economists argue that without a sustainable environment, these markets will eventually be unable to produce anything like efficiently or effectively, because if the environment is pushed to its limits, then the markets themselves will be threatened as well. So these ecological economists consider these ecological limits and costs when they analyze the efficient use of resources to promote development. So, in other words, globalization doesn't need to be a race to the bottom ecologically, but it can be a process that kind of protects and enhances the environment as much as pretty much as well as that any other um, options would, while also benefiting those who prefer to, keep the economy alive over anything else. There are some differences among nation states as well. So in 2020, an international group of scientists ranked 180 countries in terms of their environmental performance on a bunch of indicators. And these indicators included stuff like air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, sanitation, agricultural policies, and a bunch of other ones. And so the top 10 nations of their environmental performance index were many of the Nordic countries. So the first one was Denmark. Then you had Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden. They were in there as well. So the top 10 didn't include Canada and it didn't include the US. But the bottom of the list included Madagascar, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Liberia, and some of the other major economies. So Japan was number 12, Australia was 13, Italy and Canada were tied for 20, the US was 24, China was 120, India was 168. So um, the point of this indicator, though, was to note the differences between um, all of the different indicators, all of the 32 indicators, and which ones were doing best at ranking their environmental performance. So, as countries grow their economies, there can be this kind of tension between economic growth and this environmental performance. But as ecological economists point out, this is effective government policy can be promoted through economic growth within these environmental constraints. So the authors of this index made a similar observation, and they said that one of the consistent lessons of the EPI, or the environmental performance indicator, is that achieving sustainability goals requires the material prosperity to invest in the infrastructure necessary to protect health and human health and ecosystems. In a rapidly urbanizing world, it is important to build facilities for delivering improved services of drinking water, managing wastewater, and mitigating pollution, as through smokestack scrubbers. So, this inherent tension of sustainable development is that the income growth is too often coming at the cost of the environment, especially through exploitation of natural resources and unchecked industrialization. So, for the most part, you have high performing countries that have made long term commitments to protecting and promoting economic growth while reducing environmental impacts like the greenhouse gas emissions. But you've also seen countries that have kind of the opposite effect, where in contrast, we have the US that's made weaker commitments to environmental targets, where they claim that environmental performance hinders the economic growth. And thus it performs poorly on the greenhouse gas emissions, and is ranked very low compared to other high GDP countries. So, given the lower but widespread of rankings for some of the most rapidly increasing and developing economies like Brazil, China, and India, it kind of underscores both the challenges of sustainable development and the significant role that a strong policy and governance can play. Um, and so, what is important here is that we have to think about the ways that countries kind of ignore their own, like, personal, I guess it's not really personal, their nation states duties to keep upholding these factors to make sure that we're not sinking further into climate change. Um, so global climate change is defining environmental challenge of today, and it's become a rallying point for a lot of environmental movements. And there's little or no doubt, among scientists at least, that global warming is real and brought about by human activity, most notably through increases in greenhouse gases. Um, so there's been a number of researchers that have looked at all of this, and so within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was established in the late 80s, and it's continuing now. It had a 2013-2014 report that stated that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide have increased to levels that are unprecedented in the last 800,000 years. And there's scientific evidence that shows that our current period of warming is so unprecedented in observable history. And it's indeed caused by us. Like, we are definitely the cause of all of these problems. And so the predominant view is that global warming is already well advanced and it's moving ahead way more rapidly than it was predicted. And so the chairman of the panel told reporters at a news conference that nobody on this planet is going to be untouched by the impacts of climate change in 2014. Um, and when that happens is dependent on what we do. So, given this dramatic reality of climate change, many earth scientists have argued that we are entering this new geological era. And they argue that this earth is going to undergo a change that is from this relatively stable Holocene to the new Anthropocene. And so, this term comes from anthropo, meaning man, and scene, meaning new. So, this is popularized a lot by atmospheric chemist and Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen. And so this Anthropocene is characterized by these human-made and permanent ecological changes, including mass extinctions, global warming, ocean changes, and more. And so regardless of whether or not we have entered a new geological period, the effects on the human population are mounting and they're increasingly being felt by people around the world already. Um, However, there are still some people that in the general public and the business community who adhere to the view that global warming and climate change, that all of these resulting um, things that are happening, all of that is now occurring or are not the result of human actions, but they're simply part of a normal cycle that we would be going through regardless of what we're doing. And this is kind of not really surprising, but it's coming up in different industrial sectors like coal and oil. And given the material interests of these companies and having to continue their profitable business practices, even though they might contribute to climate change, it's obvious that they're just kind of ignoring it and putting it aside. Um, there are several factors that affect whether or not people are skeptical about climate change, and that's become a very partisan issue in some countries, especially for the US and Canada. So, for example, there was one analysis of newspaper editorials that were written by the most often read conservative columnists in the 2007 and 2010 range, and they show this important trend. So overall, the editorials gave Lee a very highly dismissive view of climate change and this critical stance toward climate science among these influential conservative pundits. So another analysis of both liberal and conservative newspapers that printed articles on climate change from 2001 to 2014 showed that to some degree these newspapers were functioning as these echo chambers, with the new newspaper kind of reinforcing their audience views on climate change, which is really just, you know, um, blanking here. Confirmation bias. It's just confirmation bias over and over again. You're just saying the same things to the same groups, so that it makes it feel like your ideas and your thoughts about this are, the ones that should be the most important. So when new scientific reports are revealing impacts of climate change, it's increasing concerns among Democrats but not Republicans, because when Republicans are presented with these opposing frames about climate change from these liberal media, they're rejecting the messages because they say that they're less concerned about the issue. However, in general, people who are politically conservative have less confidence in science, and sometimes they're affiliated with religion. And so sometimes this includes lower education, and that brings them to be more skeptical of climate change. And yes, that is like research based, but also people, um, you can be religious and have the same kind of views about science that people who aren't religious are. So again, take that with a grain of salt. But um, while certain media outlets kind of mislead the public about global warming and kind of addressing the problem, it ends up being a problem to address the problem at all, because there's a greater challenge because it's being shared by leading politicians like former President Donald Trump. So these populist people that are in power, they're providing the examples of, we're fine, climate change is false, go do all the things you want to do. And people will take that up and say, well, somebody told me that was fine, so I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep ignoring what's going on in the background. Um, in a lot of countries, however, the issue is not just skepticism, it's straight up denialism. So David Wallace Wells described climate change denial as this red herring that distracts us from the real issue. So climate change will have a significant disastrous effect, and we must act now. And so many of us are recognizing climate change as reality, but we're not doing enough to fight it. And for a lot of people, this lack of urgency might come because the effects of climate change on human populations can feel very abstract. It can be kind of difficult to clearly identify how climate change might affect society or affect them personally. So in the next little bit, I'm going to start talking about the different ways that we can outline some areas of impact, and that will later kind of address what can be done to minimize or reverse these environmental disasters. But of course, these impacts will have different effects across varying regions, and also across human groups. They all have varying levels of resources to cope with those impacts. Um, so the last 5 years were the hottest years on record. So 2020 was projected to be the hottest year ever. Pretty sure that 2021 and 2022 were also projected to be warmer than they were before. Um, and so as temperatures are rising on Earth, these glaciers around the world are melting, and sea levels are rising. And these temperatures are currently rising at a faster rate than even the most extreme estimates that have been predicted by scientists around the world. So relative to pre-industrial levels, we will likely see the global average rise by about 1.5 degrees Celsius at some point between 2030 and 2052. And what that might seem small at first glance, like you're sitting in your apartment and you're like, oh, well, I raised my degrees inside for zero point 0.5 degrees. You don't feel the difference. So why is it going to be important? Um, it's actually a point where scientists have projected that these effects of climate change could go from bad to devastating, and that some climate processes will become irreversible, like the loss of the glaciers. So the difference in these effects between a 1.5 degree and 2 degree increase is enormous, but these temperatures are already rising at such a rapid pace, that are increasing the rise of sea levels at a rate that's faster than any time during the previous 2 millennia. So to put this in perspective, you have 65 square kilometers or 25 square miles, however you want to think about it. That's the amount that the sea level is rising each year. So if you go on a map and you measure out 65 square kilometers, that's how much the sea levels are rising. And if you do that over a period of time, then you're going to have this accumulation where you're not going to be able to get rid of all the rest of the water. And this is going to be a problem for a lot of people because of rising sea levels and this loss of land. So all of the coastal areas, they're going to displace a lot of people that are living there. Climate refugees are being displaced already by environmental changes that are brought about by climate change, such as rising sea levels, drought, the increase in hurricanes, floods, and other environmental disasters. This past year, we saw BC have some really nasty things going on, with um, their fires. Was that this past year? I believe it was. And then also the flooding. So back to back, they had two like massive environmental issues that they had to deal with. And that's part of the reason why we need to start dealing with all of this stuff. Um, so we talked about already the global flow of people, including refugees, and here's where we can kind of focus on those being displaced by climate processes. So by 2050, there's likely going to be about 200 million people that are displaced by climate change. And these estimates kind of increase or decrease depending on who you talk to and who you're talking about, what populations you're talking about. But basically, it's between 25 million and a billion people. And one particularly vulnerable area is Maldives, a nation of 1,200 islands in the Indian Ocean. And so the Maldives' highest point of elevation is a whopping 2.3 meters above sea level. A lot of its population of 300, almost 400,000 people live only a few feet from the ocean waves. Another one is a city called Kivalina in Alaska, and it's one of the first American towns that are going to be lost to climate change. And it's predicted to happen by 2025. So it's not like it's, 2050, it's going to be too far out that we don't really feel it because looking through 30 years down the road to us doesn't feel like anything, but it's going to be gone probably by 2025. That means within 3 years that this town is going to be gone because the town sits in this small peninsula and is home to about 400 indigenous people. So that's another thing. How many people are being impacted by this on the coastlines? Are they the people that have a lot of money that can afford to move, or are they the people that are going to be displaced first and don't have the sources and they are being forced out of their lands? So for generations, these people have depended on the sea for their survival, and they're going to lose all of that soon. And the cost of relocating them is estimated to be about 100 million, $100 million US. And so, as more people become climate change refugees, we can expect to see kind of this increasing um, conflict at borders as these people have to flee to new areas as well. So, we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. There's also this concern about how global warming will affect the rapidity of which ice sheets over Greenland and the Arctic and Antarctica are going to melt. And if all of the ice on Greenland alone, just Greenland, were to melt, then sea levels are going to rise 23 feet. And they would rise again another 17 feet after the Antarctic glacier started to melt. And this rise would be a global catastrophe, leading to the end of life on a lot of islands and a lot of coastal civilizations around the world. Um, and same with the 1.5-degree increase, that it's important to remember that it's an average and the change will be greater in some areas and less in others. So for some of the world's regions, they're likely to see extreme temperatures that are going to make it difficult to sustain human life. If global warming is not slowed, one study found that up to a third of the world's population could live in extreme heat zones by 2070. And these are likely to be focused in Africa, India, the Middle East, South America, Southeast Asia, and Australia. And one of the only current extreme heat zones is the Sahara region of Africa. So this is going to be another huge loss of areas that are suitable for human life. And that's going to be compounded by the fact that they have the areas that are growing the highest. They have the fastest growing populations in the world. So it's only going to get worse on that as well. There's also a lot of destruction occurring to animal habitats and biodiversity. One of these processes, such as deforestation, is a major drive of climate change. So one of the areas that has the most rapid deforestation in the world is the Gran Chaco, which is the second largest forest in South America after the Amazon, especially in Paraguay, but also other parts of the world that are destroying and losing their forests. So from 2000 to 2012, the countries that experienced the worst deforestation were Malaysia, Paraguay, Indonesia, Guatemala, and Cambodia, and they all lost between 7 and 14% of their forests. However, Brazil and its immense forested landmass has increased the greatest total deforestation, which is likely to get much worse. But in 2017, Brazil estimated that its enormous Amazon reserve, which had been dubbed the biggest attack on the Amazon in the last 50 years, they were talking about how deforestation in that single year increased by 64%. So in total, approximately a third of the world's forests have been entirely cleared, and that there's another 20% that have been degraded. So you're going to see that these forests are being decimated and they're just being allowed the area to be developed. So to create farms and areas for livestock to graze, or it's a creation of more human settlements. And in the case of the Amazon, the government is opening up these areas to foreign investments to mine for gold and copper and other precious minerals that are expensive. Um, and what is different about Brazil today is that its forest is so huge and it plays such a large role in the global ecology that its destruction will have such a negative impact on the world as a whole. So, for example, the forest absorbs and processes much of the world's carbon. And so deforestation reduces the Earth's capacity for removing these greenhouse gases. And in addition, the burning of all of these trees that have fallen releases large amounts of carbon dioxide that flow around the world, and they contribute to global climate change even further. And the destruction of the forest also leads to other problems for humans, including the loss of timber and other raw materials. Um, it's also of great concern, especially within the areas that are undergoing deforestation, because the forests are providing ecosystem services such as protecting watersheds and protecting soil against erosion. And basically, they constitute essential steps in the water cycle, and that generates a lot of their rainfall, and that provides habitats for a lot of plants and animal species. So entire ecosystems are being impacted, and that's going to dramatically reduce biodiversity. And so deforestation and desertification, they're already altering the natural ecosystem with profound effects on biodiversity, especially the wetlands. And Animal and human food systems and the overall functioning of the local environments are all having impacts. And so ecologists have shown that these ecosystems are relying on the interactions of multiple species within a specific local environment. And researchers have said that these systems are providing food and fresh water and raw materials for construction and fuel. They regulate climate and air quality. They buffer against the natural hazards like floods and storms. They pollinate crops. They maintain soil fertility and the genetic diversity of the planet's various different life forms are providing these raw ingredients and new medicines and new commercial crops and livestock, including those that are better suited to conditions under a changed climate. Um, and these are systems that humans know still very little about. So, about out of the 1.7 million known species, fewer than 4% have actually been fully evaluated by scientists. So, for each known species, it's likely two or more species that haven't been discovered yet. And so, the possibility of these species of extinction and is about 20% of them are going to be extinct or are at risk of being extinct in the near future. And if they don't become extinct, these plants and animals are going to change as their environment changes. And so the problem is that as a result of evolution, these plants and animals can adapt to these gradual changes. But the changes are already underway and they're way more rapid than they're accustomed to. And so evolution is not going to be able to keep up in that same way that it would be before. Um, so, for example, you have polar bears that live on Arctic ice, and they're one animal that is already experiencing the worst effect of climate change. They're likely to be profoundly affected in the near future. We all remember having grown up with, protecting the polar bears and Coca-Cola saying that we had to protect the polar bears, even though they were, selling stuff that was probably making it worse by dealing with the plastic problem and taking the fresh water for different soft drinks. But the shrinking, the melting of the ice that they live on is it's making it more difficult or even impossible for a lot of these polar bears to live. And so the polar bears in the Arctic and the penguins that are in the Antarctic are already reacting and are on the move, trying to compensate for these changes. And they're likely to experience a 30% decline in population by the mid-century, so within 2050. So these animals are affected in different ways by climate change. And so in terms of adverse effects, you've got migrating birds that might migrate earlier only to find that they have little food or they have ground that is ice covered. Rodents that can't live in warm temperatures might need to move higher and higher on mountains in order to find temperatures that like allow them to survive. Frogs might disappear as the climate changes. A few frog species have already started to kind of disappear in Costa Rica because of the reduction in cloudiness, and it's reduce the damp and foggy and misty weather that they need to survive. And so, while some of these climate changes are going to affect people in various parts of the world differently, one change that will affect pretty much everybody everywhere is the changes that are being brought into farming and livestock and fisheries that affect our entire food supply. And so this could have a very disastrous consequence for food security, where climate change might increase water shortages and crop failures. So in these kinds of events, these food prices that we're going to be seeing are going to increase very rapidly. So this is already being seen with some of the effects of inflation. And yes, COVID has made it a little bit worse for us, but a part of the reason for inflation is already due to crop production and livestock changes. So beef is especially detrimental for climate change, and its supply could be constrained in the future. So scientists have widely noted that beef and beef cattle systems, they emit more greenhouse gas per unit of output than any other agricultural product. And there are several reasons for this. So first, you have cattle that produce large amounts of methane from their feces, which contribute directly to greenhouse gases that create global warming. Second, raising cattle requires an unusually high level of resources to have secondary environmental impacts. For example, it takes almost 1,800 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef, where in comparison, pork only requires about 575 gallons of water, soybeans only about 200, and corn about 100 gallons. So that's a huge difference in water just for one type of livestock. Third, you also have the development of land for beef production, especially in the tropical climates, that often involves clearing out the forest lands, deforestation. which can further reduce the Earth's ability to process carbon properly. And so, while there are efforts and steps that can reduce the environmental impact of beef production, the reality is that beef will always be very resource intensive and is one of the single largest contributors to climate change. Accordingly, as the Earth becomes warmer, producing beef will become more difficult and more costly. Crops are also severely affected. So farmland is being degraded by these natural processes, and soil is being carried away from the erosion that's caused by water and wind. You have industrial farming practices like monocropping that are declining soil fertility. You have global warming, which is worsening all of these problems. And since, as I've already noted, like global warming is leading to this desertification of several areas, and this usable farmland has declined at the same time that the global population and its need for agricultural products have increased significantly. And so the changes to crops as a result of global warming are already observable. So you have crops of many staples like corn and wheat who are at a lower altitude regions, and those have already been declining. And you have animal growth rates in some pastoral systems like Africa that have slowed. And while it's true that some yields like corn, wheat, sugar beets in high altitude regions have increased, these are unlikely to compensate for all the pressures that we've placed on the agricultural systems, especially as global warming continues. In total, we've had land degradation, which has already reduced the agricultural productivity by almost 25% of the world's land. So less farmland and the increasing demand of food is going to drive up prices in land and food. And so the effects on food security will be greatest in the south, in the lower latitudes of the world, in India, in Africa, in Latin America, where a lot of these people who are poor that are already living in those sections in the world, it's just going to get worse for them. And this doesn't take into account the other adverse changes like new pests and diseases that are likely to plague the agricultural systems. Um, and so we have to be mindful of this in food security. It's the worst is yet to come. We've only just scratched the surface of food insecurity. And a large fraction of the protein that is consumed by humans comes from fish and to a lesser extent, shellfish. So in 2018, the world had its highest per capita seafood consumption ever, thereby relying on seafood more than ever. So the United Nations argues that the marine and inland fisheries are crucial to meet the goal of a world without hunger and malnutrition. However, a lot of fishing areas like the Mediterranean are in severe decline or have already started to collapse. So the number of fisheries that are overfished has increased very steadily over time. Without seafood, we're going to see these overfished stocks increase from, from they were at 10% in 1974. They're at or already are at 35%, and they're only going to increase from there. Um, and without seafood, more people are going to need to rely on meat and protein and livestock that can only be grown at a greater cost and with great damage to the environment. And aquaculture, or the farming of aquatic organisms, is not an adequate replacement for these natural fishing areas um, because it causes a lot of serious ecological and other problems. So, marine life in the world's oceans have been diminished by overfishing and pollution and global warming. And as this sea life declines, the techniques involved to compensate are becoming more industrialized and intensive. So, drift nets were used until 1992 when they were banned by the high seas on the high seas by the UN. And so we've created other technology that was capable of ensnaring a lot of marine life, some unwanted and some wanted. And so the unwanted fish would just be, discarded into the sea. And so not only does this contribute to overfishing, but also destroys the other complex ecosystems that existed there in the process. So it's catching things that they don't want to be catched, and so or caught. Sorry. So those nets are catching these unwanted fish that are discarded, and then it's over 20% of the fish that are hauled out of American and Canadian waters. So over 1 million tons, they're all discarded as bycatch. So one of the worst examples of this is occurring with the bottom trawling in the harvest of shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico, and that method leads to over 80% of bycatch. So innumerable plants and corals are uprooted and caught in this trawling, and they're destroyed in the process. So just because we're trying to get out these kind of single fish species, we're ending up with having near extinction for other ones as a result of this industrial fishing. And that's the responsible thing to do, is stop fishing until there's this effective management that, we can become in a place where we can make sure that the reversal of the population decline is something that we can do. However, probably not going to happen. So climate change is another main contributor to the decline in the fish stocks as well. So, because the oceans absorb a lot of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, their temperatures are increasing very steadily and they're altering their ocean currents. And this affects the which species are surviving and thriving, where they can survive in the ocean, and it destroys the fish's habitats. Um, and so, the most important fish habitats are coral reefs, and those are rapidly disappearing. There have been three global mass bleaching events that have destroyed a lot of the highly complex ecosystems. So, for example, they've destroyed large sections of the Great Barrier Reef, which is the world's largest reef near Australia's north coast. And this is comprised of more than 2,900 individual reefs. And so, over 50% of the world's coral reefs have died in the last 30 years, and they are expecting up to 90 to die in the next century. Um, so without these reefs as in the ecosystems, the entire food chain for the marine life is going to collapse. And so, in addition to the enormous loss of food and protein for humans, this collapse would also destroy the livelihood of millions of people and communities that depend on them. And so, while the availability of fresh water has also been a problem for a lot of times, global warming is also intensifying that problem as well. So, there's a lot of concerns about water pollution, with one result being waterborne diseases like Giardia, flooding, especially with global warming, the increased scarcity of water, the need to choose between the water that's drinkable and the crops that need water, what can be produced with it, the loss of glaciers as a freshwater source, and the possibility that the flows of water could slow or stop completely, at least in some locales. And so we come back to this desertification, or the decline in water supply, as a result of the degradation and the deterioration of soil and vegetation. And because of this degradation and deterioration, the water that was once considered a public good is increasingly becoming a valuable, for like, privatized commodity, as many places run low and in some cases begin to run out of drinkable water. So there is likely to be an increase in the number and escalation of the actions of social movements that are involved to deal with the various issues that relate to water. And when we usually think of water as abundant and readily available, the fact is that about 2.2 billion people, or 29% of the global population, already lack basic access to locally available drinking water. And even more people, 4.2 billion, don't have basic sanitation access. And that poses a lot of problems for local water sources and an array of health concerns. So, the poorest areas of the globe and the poorest people that are in those areas, especially women and children, experience a disproportionate share of water related problems. And the situation is going to grow worse in the coming years, with the possibility that as many as half of the world's population will be faced with water security problems by the 2030s. Um, and the water problems in this as well involves international trade, especially within agricultural and industrial products. So, for example, if Japan is buying crops that are water intensive produced in the US, the pressure is on the American water supplies. So, in other words, Japanese consumers are contributing to the mining of aquifers and emptying of rivers in North America within this example. Vice versa, if it was, we were buying from China and it's Chinese fruit that we're buying, then it's hampering in on the Chinese water supply, whereas we're not feeling that kind of impact in North America. So, without even really realizing it, people throughout the world are using water from everywhere else in the world. So, kind of like this virtual water, especially Australia and North America. And if they don't realize that they're using it or abusing it, how can they be known to do anything about it? So, as we talked about, global climate change is going to make some parts of the world wetter, but other parts are going to grow drier. And so, as a general rule, already wet areas will grow more wet or wetter, and dry areas drier. So, you'll have floods and droughts both intensifying. And it's a lot of the time you're going to see a lot of increasing desperate and expensive efforts to find water because we need water to survive. So among those areas that are going to be drier are going to be Southern Europe, parts of the Middle East, Australia, and some parts of the Southwestern US. So, for example, parts of California saw that there's 6 years of drought and in 2017, but water shortages are also set to become the new normal. And there are also predictions of Dust Bowl like situations in the American Southwest and the resulting possibility of these mass migrations that are going to happen. Similar situations are occurring with more dire implications for Mexico, where similar conditions will also lead to mass migration to Mexican cities and to still more likely unauthorized migration to the US. So, such an increase, it threatens to create greater problems and animosities that are already existing in the US as a result of the documented and undocumented immigration from Mexico. So, in general terms, we're going to see a lot more climate refugees and we're going to see a lot more conflict. Um, Another water related problem is the melting due to global warming of the mountain glaciers that are such an important source for the flow of drinking water to many people in the world. And so, as those glaciers are melting and fail to kind of reform fully, they will provide less and less water for those below them who need the water to survive. And so the affected populations are likely to also become climate refugees, and they're likely to come into conflict with residents of, excuse me, of the still water-rich areas to which they are likely to move. So you'll see in the US, Georgia and Florida are the states that are southwestern US as two examples where you're going to have trading threats over common and disputed water supplies. And this is already happening, and it's just going to get worse over time. And as we discuss within climate, these tensions about water and water use will increase in the future, leading to probably open national and global warfare over water. So all of these issues are going to be um, increased, but you're also going to have stuff like complications that are increasing as well. So these adverse health complications are going to be increasing with heat waves, such excessive heat that can be deadly. Heat waves in Europe in 2003, the worst in 500 years, caused over 30,000 deaths from heat related illnesses. We saw the same in BC over the summer. We saw the same in California over the summer, where people were dying because it was so hot. Elderly people that didn't live with air conditioning units died in their homes because they couldn't move, they couldn't leave, and they were stuck to basically just cook to death, um, leading to dehydration and just dying. And so the people who are the most vulnerable are going to be the most ill and die the fastest. And most of the time, these are people who are already suffering from other um, issues within inequality. So this could be the people who are very young, the very poor, the very old, the very young. Um, these people are not going to be able to leave from these superheated areas to find somewhere where it's easier for them to survive. And of course, those who are in the north are more likely to be able to find themselves different mechanisms to survive, like getting air conditioning or finding a freshwater lake to swim in to cool yourself down. Um, and we're also going to see a lot of more severe storms that are going to lead to death, including increase from flooding due to storms. Residents are going to be more likely to be stranded or cut off from access to healthcare in these emergencies. Um, and so we're going to see a lot of different issues, but we've already seen what we're kind of expecting, where you've got Hurricane Sandy that devastated the Atlantic coast in 2012. Like, we've already seen this. We already know that it's coming. We already know what it will look like and what's going to happen to people if we don't change. And yet, here we are still continuing. Increased heat will also speed up chemical reactions and make pollution worse from ozone and soot. Deaths from ozone pollution, mostly with those who have like either heart or lung problems, are set to rise by 5% in 2050. Increased pollen production could increasingly affect those with asthma and other allergies. Waterborne diseases like cholera will start to increase in higher temperatures. Foodborne infections like salmonella will also start to increase with hotter weather. And so malnutrition will result from these threats to the food supply as well. Another health effect of global warming is the increased spread of infectious diseases like Lyme disease. So, for anybody who doesn't know, Lyme disease is caused by a bacterial infection, and it's spread through tick bites from any ticks that are infected. And these symptoms include stuff like headaches and neck stiffness, joint pain, joint swelling, heart palpitations, irregular heartbeat, swollen lymph nodes, inflammation of the brainstem or spinal cord, nerve pain, insomnia. I could go on. It's not a fun disease to have. If the illness is diagnosed within 30 days, it can be cured most often with antibiotics, but if not, then people are stuck with it and their debilitating symptoms for the rest of their lives. And so global warming is already helping the spread of Lyme disease because the warmer temperatures are allowing the ticks and other insects and animals spreading diseases to survive in more and more regions for more of the seasons of the year. So studies predict a dramatic rise in Lyme in much of the world, including like a 92% increase in the US and Canada. With rising temperatures, we also see an increase in malaria and dengue borne mosquitoes. So, exposure to malaria is expected to increase by 25% in Africa by 2050. And so, you have these huge areas of the world that are going to be, taken over by mosquito populations that are going to be killing people. And so, you have to try and control the mosquito population with pesticides, even though those are already posing hazards, or use bed nets, especially for pregnant women and children, and get better medical care. Um, and other diseases of this kind of genre that are likely to become more prevalent include different bug carrying diseases or diseases that are carried by snails, or like yellow fever, or the chikungunya virus, which is also carried by mosquitoes. Um, and finally, global warming is also likely to bring more diseases in general, especially pandemics like COVID-19. So, as humans kind of encroach on animal habitats, the risk of viruses and other diseases mutating and migrating from humans to animals and animals to humans also increases. So, with COVID-19, this coronavirus, it had to likely affect a horseshoe bat in China, and it was carried through an intermediate host, and it made its way to people, and then here we are, COVID all over the world. And so climate change will continue to push people from their current population centers into new animal habitats. And similarly, deforestation and ecosystem loss will also drive animal from their previous habitats closer to humans. So these double-sided ecological pressures will increase this type of exposure dramatically, bringing about a lot of new health risks. And so all of these coming together will also increase armed conflict and violence, because it's especially true when a society depends on natural resources that are no longer available, and when groups are fighting with each other to control this limited supply. So, while this is most obvious with drinking water and the food supply, it can also be about other resources like energy, which all social infrastructure kind of relies on. And so, as people have to compete for the basic necessities like water, we're going to see more barriers created by territories interested in retaining their water and food supplies and preventing their flow to neighboring territories. So, global warming can also trigger armed conflict through the result of economic shocks like dramatic increases in the price of land and basic goods, mass unemployment, and these events should have uneven effect on populations, jeopardizing these different groups because of the ways that inequalities are already being faced by people. And finally, you'll have climate refugees that result from rising seas, desertification, extreme temperatures, and other sources. And that's going to increase the local competition for these resources and start new resentments toward the influx of new groups. And so all of these linkages between climate change and armed conflict are mediated by other factors. By itself, climate change is unlikely to instigate armed conflict, but global warming increases the likelihood of armed conflict emerging or worsening, where there are other, contributing factors like low economic development, low stability, low state capability in controlling group conflict. There's going to be intergroup inequality, like ethnic differences across groups, and there's already been recent history of conflict in areas, so that's just going to restart. So basically, in other words, climate change is this threat multiplier where there's other risks over a bunch of things. We already have difficulties with water. We already have difficulties with food. We already have difficulties with keeping everybody like civil with each other, and that's going to just increase the odds of all of these problems getting worse by about 10 to 20%. Some other environmental problems, as if we didn't have enough, they're global in the sense that we have them flowing readily around the world, and there are very few barriers to these flows. So while there's not enough space to address all of them here, this section of the lecture is going to deal with some of the other environmental problems that face the world. So supplies of relatively easily obtained fossil fuels like oil and coal are being used up very rapidly. We're getting at more getting more of these reserves is going to require deeper underground and increasingly expensive processes to get the extractions of this coal and oil. And one very controversial method that's used commonly in the US and in Canada is hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And so fracking is a relatively new technique that applies this high pressure stream of water and chemicals that dislodges pockets of natural gas that can be miles below the Earth's surface. And so this practice has revolutionized the oil and gas industry in North America and is increasingly in other countries. But there's a number of concerns that have we should have at least over the environmental and health effects that fracking um, leads to. So, for example, fracking could lead to local earthquakes, the flow back of water and chemicals that could be cancerous to humans, and large volumes of newly released methane that can contribute further to global warming. New cavities that are created from fracking, the potential for oil and hazardous chemicals to escape, also pose very great risks for contaminating local water sources. However, the method has been very quickly adopted with little scientific study, and the effects that of these practices are still not completely clear. And given these concerns, Europe has experienced widespread protests against fracking, making them a lot slower to adopt these techniques. And as well, we also have the flow of fossil fuels growing increasingly problematic and creating more and more barriers. So, for example, oil producing nations needing to have this ever larger production of oil that they produce for themselves. And that's going to emerge to further reduce the flow as well. And so, another issue, we've already kind of talked about this with water, but water is becoming increasingly important as a global commodity in many places as they run low on or completely run out of drinkable water. So, for example, in 2018, the city of Cape Town in South Africa and its 4 million inhabitants nearly ran out of drinking water entirely. At the same time, there's been enormous growth in this global distribution and sale of bottled water. And so, bottled water has become this global commodity that's commanding relatively high prices. However, it's too expensive for the poorest people in the world who may be in need of this as a result of the decline in the available water supplies. And so sales of bottled water are more likely to thrive off in the relatively well-off areas of the world where there's still plenty of drinkable water that's freely available. But instead of using this inexpensive and accessible water, we have a lot of people, especially in the north, that are buying bottled water, which is sometimes shipped from the distant locales, like bottled water being the top selling beverage in the US by volume. And so we've got this manufactured need or this perceived need that's created through marketing that's kind of exacerbated all of these environmental problems. So the great use of fuel by airplanes and ships that transport all of this bottled water contributes to the pollution of global warming as well. And also, almost 80% of these empty water bottles end up in landfills, and most of them are not being recycled. And so that takes approximately 1,000 years to decompose, which is just making it worse with other issues within the environment. One of the most outrageous example of this is the Fiji water, which is the world's top water brand, with hundreds of millions of sales in years per year, um, hundreds of millions of sales. So that means hundreds of millions of water bottles. And this water is literally produced and bottled in Fiji. And it's transported thousands of places like New York and London. And it requires 1.75 gallons of water to produce, export, and distribute a single bottle of Fiji water compared with tap water. And these processes consume 2,000 times more energy. So we're aware of the danger that it poses to the environment, and so does Fiji. So Fiji Water has announced plans to use renewable energy, like building a windmill to power its bottling plant, to preserve forests and cut its carbon footprint by shipping its water bottles by sea to the East Coast rather than by truck to Los Angeles after it gets there by ship. So that's great, but a lot of their promises have fallen very short, and that's planning, to do something is great, but having the sustainability of that initiative is something else. But even if Fiji Water was to meet all of its sustainability goals, the executive director of the Rainforest Action Network said that bottled water is a business that is fundamentally, inherently, and inalterably unconscionable. So no sides deal to protect the forest or combat global warming that can offset the reality of what is being done. Um, so huge problem there. Another big problem is the human-made chemicals, the toxic chemicals that are currently existing in the world. So beginning with industrialization, this rapidly expanding industrialization in the last 50 to 70 years, the manufacturing of the human-made chemicals has posed significant threat to the environment and human health. And among the culprits are insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, mercury and other metals, fire retardant chemicals, refrigerator coolants, detergents, and different components of plastics. And all of these have a variety of immediate and more usually long-term negative effects of humans and other forms of life. So there's an example of the persistent organic pollutants, which are highly toxic human-made chemicals. And among these are polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, once used as coolants in various pesticides. And so these POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, have four characteristics in common. They're highly toxic, they're persistent, they remain in the environment for years before breaking down and becoming less harmful, and they can travel very large distances. So what is locally produced may create local problems, but it can also easily become a global problem because the role in the of these chemicals is impacting stuff like the ozone layer and the relationship of global health problems relating to exposure to ultraviolet radiation. And so the impact of these pops can be magnified through the process of bioaccumulation, biomagnification, and this concentration that is built up for a long time over in the food chains. And so these toxic chemicals are especially widespread in industrial agriculture. So, for example, a 5.1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the US each year. And the rise of genetically modified seeds, which enable the plants to withstand greater amounts of pesticides, have helped to increase the amount of pesticides used. And these pesticides have a variety of negative effects on the environment and human health. So they seep into the ground and they can contaminate drinking water. They can spill into rivers and streams, which damages the ecosystems. Farm laborers who are exposed to these chemicals experience higher rate of illness. You've got children who are particularly susceptible to the effects of these pesticides, including having leukemia, pediatric cancers, decreasing their cognitive functioning, impairing their neurological development, having behavioral problems. All of these problems, because they're directly exposed to these toxins, it's changing them. And you also see population growth as another problem. So currently, we're pretty close. We're pushing 8 billion, and the UN predicts that we'll reach 9.7 billion by 2050. And so this significant population growth, especially in the south, we're going to see some populations remain relatively stable or decline in the north, but we're going to keep our populations up because of immigration. These are going to exacerbate the kinds of ecological problems discussed above and before in the lecture, and these are going to produce new ones as well. And so it's not the sheer numbers themselves that matter or the most. It's what the population is consuming, and there are a lot of variations around the world in consumption. So the roughly 1.3 billion people who live in developed countries, especially those that are in the U.S., they have a consumption rate of 32. That's their per capita consumption rate of 32. So it's much less in the developed world where you have, people who are approaching a rate of 1 or 32 times less consumption daily than people in the US or in North America in general. So from an ecological point of view, the greatest problems are produced by us, and the largest populations are going to have the worst impact. And so even though the large populations have the highest consumption rates overall, we are the ones that are consuming the most. Um, there's also looming increase in ecological problems traceable to booming populations in the economies of India and China, who have 1.45 billion people, giving it a very much larger population than North America. Their consumption rates still rank far below those in North America and Europe, but they are increasing very rapidly. So there's a lot of strain that can be placed on the resources and the ecology of the planet, and so it's going to impact China and India's consumption rates as well, and that's going to approach somewhat close to those of the developed countries. And of course, this could be compensated by a decline in the consumption rate in the developed world, which might be inevitable with the ongoing global redistribution of wealth, as well as various conservation efforts. But it's going to be it's going to be very difficult for people to accept that they need to scale back if they don't think that climate change and global warming and all of these issues are real. On top of that, we also have the global flow of waste. So all parts of the world produce garbage, and that is dangerous, or at least potentially dangerous. So examples of concern here include e-waste, like discarded television sets, computers, printers, cell phones, and so on. So it's the highly developed northern countries that produce this disproportionate amount of waste. And so once products have outlived their usefulness, or way longer before that, like we just throw stuff out when it could, it could be used as a second life. Once it's reduced to garbage, the developed nations want nothing more to do with it. They seek to spend much of this waste to less developed countries for their part. Um, and they're somewhat willing to receive the garbage since it can be transformed into work, into jobs, into profits. And very often, the waste that is unloaded onto these countries have components and elements like gold and silver and copper that are valuable. So these are difficult and time consuming to extract. But from the perspective of global corporations and in governments, the poorly paid workers of less developed countries are ideal for this unskilled work. And so few in the developed world actually want to do this work. Nobody wants to dig through trash up here, especially for those that are paying much less in the developed world. They'll take on the work, but we would not be willing to do it. You also have many of the things that are found in e-waste being dangerous. So, for example, a cell phone has about 200 chemical compounds, and it's not clear which are hazardous and which are not. So, when workers in these developing countries are dismantling, burning, or pouring acid on cell phones, it's unclear what toxic chemicals are being released and how they are affected in the processes that release them. So what is clear is that there are many toxic elements involved, and it is the workers in less developed countries who are being exposed to them. And furthermore, you also have the population as a whole in those areas being endangered, since what remains after the valuable e-waste is removed is often very carelessly discarded to poison the land, crops, and so on. So one of the roots of the problems here is the fact that people in developed countries are discarding electronics of all sorts before the equipment has exhausted its useful life. So, for example, people buying the newest iPhone and discarding the old ones often, or at least initially just by dumping them in a drawer at home, but eventually throwing them out. Not because the old ones haven't stopped functioning, but just because they need the newest design. They need the newest set of cameras that the iPhone is providing. You need to, no longer have a headphone jack because Apple decided that was useless. You're getting rid of your old phone and it's going to end up in the garbage eventually. And so many of these older phones could be recycled, but very few people have any interest in actually doing what is necessary to recycle these phones. On top of that, you have hazardous wastes coming from electronics being the only one dimension of these enormous flows of garbage. And to make things worse, not all of this waste is finding its ways into landfills. It's also getting into waterways. And so a lot of the material is ending up in the stomachs of birds or marine animals who are obviously unable to digest any of these substances. And so ultimately it ends up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as well, which is known as the Pacific Trash Vortex. And this is located in the northern Pacific Ocean. And it's this massive non-biodegradable floating plastics and chemical sludge and other marine pollution, varying from larger objects like fishing nets and water bottles to micro-sized particles from household cleaners. And this garbage patch covers the area twice the size of Texas. And it's one of several large oceanic waste areas, and each of them is forming where the ocean currents intersect in a way that kind of suspends the plastic and other waste in particular locations. And it's estimated by 2050 that there's going to be more plastics in the ocean than fish. So waste is a huge, huge problem, huge environmental problem. So given all of these problems associated with global warming and the global environmental flows that we've talked about here, especially climate change, it can feel very overwhelming. So the good news is that there are feasible solutions, and some have already shown to be more helpful than others significantly improve the environmental outcomes. When it comes to climate change, the issue is less about whether or not people believe it is real. It's instead the issue is whether people, the governments, and businesses are going to act fast enough to stop its most detrimental effects. Um, and so the IPCC estimates that we have less than 10 years to avoid the worst impacts of human induced climate change. So there's this urgent need for a coordinated and effective global response. And the starting point for understanding the global responses is recognizing that a lot of global environmental problems, especially climate change, are traceable to modernization and economic development. And in particular, we have as economies are growing larger and they're more successful, they're more likely to do increasing damage to the environment in general, but also in ways that they produce things and what they produce. So factories are polluting, and automobiles that are being made are polluting further. And so, as concerned as nation states are becoming about this damage to the environment, they are not about to give up either the fruits of the development or cease seeking these things that are going to be developed because it's putting money in everybody's pockets. And so this leads to the most important concept of sustainable development. Um, this is a concept that originated from the 1987 report by the UN on the World Commission of Environment and Development, and that was entitled Our Common Future. And in the view of the authors in this report, sustainable development, which should be applied to all countries, involves economic and environmental changes that meet the needs of the present, especially of the world's poor, without jeopardizing the needs of the future. And so while the focus of sustainable development is on physical sustainability, there has to also be a concern for equity within the current generation and for future generations as well. And so the key event that happened in this history of global environmentalism, indeed within globalization as well, was this 1992 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, labeled the Earth Summit. And it was formerly the United Nations Conference on Environmental Development. Um, so it's known as the factor that legitimized and advanced the concept of sustainable development. Um, and while sustainable development was focused on the environment, the term has come kind of used more broadly or indiscriminately to include using renewable energy and farming organically to increase local self-sufficiency and undertaking this radical political decentralization as well. And so globalization can either be seen as a threat or a boon to sustainability. So, as a threat, globalization can be seen as leading to unsustainable development by undermining these regulatory capacities of the nation states and local communities and depleting biological and social diversity in favor for this overconsumption. And globalization can aid sustainable development through the enhanced penetration of markets and diffusion of these modern technologies and globalization of standards. So it's leading to an enhanced efficiency of resource use and demand for cleaner environments. So there are arguments on both for globalization. And while the concept of sustainable development has become popular, there are at least three key issues involved in this notion. So the first is that the difficulty involved in developing reliable projections of what is likely to happen in an ecosystem in the future is the main one. So it's hard to kind of think about what is going to be reliable later on because we don't know enough about what needs to be done. Second, we also need to seek and maintain the current ecosystem or uh, ask whether we can, rely on its knowledge and production right now to compensate or more than compensate for the loss that has already been a result of these declines in the ecosystem. And third, and the biggest debate is over the causes of the current unsustainability in our ecosystem. So the main difference is that those who argue the main cause is population growth, and those who say that it is high levels of production and consumption, it's developed countries regardless. So overall, there's a strong relationship to the debate over sustainability between the environment and economic development, but it's all coming down to the developed countries. And so there's also this deeper issue, which is whether economic development is even possible without causing substantial or, if not overwhelming damage to the environment. And some scholars about sustainable that argue about sustainable and development say that it's not truly sustainable to have this kind of economic development. And so they're basically saying that this development needs to be limited. And if it's not, then you're going to have, people who are going to suffer the consequences of your economic development. And even more critical in this view is taken by some in, especially with indigenous perspectives, that argue that development as a goal in itself should be taken out completely. So in Bolivia, for example, indigenous activists are critical of the economic and capitalistic natures of development, and they advocate for political alternatives that enable people to like truly coexist with the natural environment. And this approach could be including preserving and restoring nature. And so these activists are promoting a local decolonial notion of the good life as an alternate guide for this state policy on sustainable development. Um, there are a number of dimensions to the relationship between globalization and sustainability. So, first, there is the economic dimension and the issue of whether economic development destroys the environment, of whether the economic development is enabling the desire and the ability to better control the factors that are adversely affecting the environment. Second, technology can be seen as both producing environmental degradation and creating the possibility of limiting this damage. Third, there's also the dimension of awareness. So, on one hand, you have a nation's integration within world policy through this presence of civil and political international organization, which all tend to lead to more individual environmental concern. But on the other hand, you also have people who are unclear about whether global media have led to this greater awareness of environmental problems and their causes, or whether this consumerism is also pushed by the global media in increasing people's blindness to these issues. And finally, there's the politics of environmentalism with some global organizations like the World Trade Organization. They're pushing for more economic growth, while many others, like different environmental non-governmental organizations, are seeking to kind of reduce or limit its negative impact on the environment. So overall, while many elements of globalization are clearly detrimental to the already fragile efforts at environmental protection, there are those who believe that economic benefits resulting from globalization will increase society's general capacity to deal with these environmental problems overall. So, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus that human activity is largely, the major factor for global warming, many major corporations and some governments, especially the U.S., have resisted taking action to limit carbon emissions. And so this has made it very difficult to develop and implement multilateral agreements to address climate change. Um, so you have a couple of different examples of that. So there was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which was a major deal for efforts related to climate change, trying to cut carbon emissions. And so ratifying nations would have been required by 2012 to reduce their emissions by 5% below what they were in 1990. And the agreement created these ceilings for carbon emissions of developed countries, but none for the developing countries, especially for China and India. So many nations ratified this protocol, but it required that countries were responsible for a total of 55% of the emissions to be signatories. And it did not reach that required percentage. And most notable in that fact was that the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And in 2001, it was finally rejected by President George W. Bush. Arguments against the treaty were that it was based on questionable science, it would hurt the American economy, and that it wasn't fair and would not be successful because of the rapidly developing nations like China and India, because they weren't restricted in terms of their emissions. Another failed attempt at a multilateral agreement to fight climate change was Copenhagen in 2009, where there was significant progress made during this 2016 Paris Agreement. Some commenters called it a historic deal, in which representatives from 195 countries reached this landmark that will, for the first time, commit to nearly every country lowering planet warming greenhouse gas emissions to help stave off this most dramatic effect of climate change. And the fact is that it transcended previous north south divides, and it included the world's two largest polluters, which were US and China. And they had major accomplishments. And this deal was facilitated in part by sustaining behind the scenes negotiation by the US, China, and India. And so The US Secretary of State at the time of the deal worked very closely with the Chinese and Indian representatives to overcome previous differences in the agreement. And so, for their part, Chinese officials had been facing increased criticism for air pollution from their coal burning power plants. And developing countries had originally sought $100 billion annually to help them with combating climate change as they developed economically. But they ultimately gave up after they to try and help reach a deal. However, the Paris Agreement had a lot of limitations, especially with legal mandates. And it was highly dependent on future national governments to carry out the deal. So, one expert went so far to say that the Paris Agreement to ignore reality, noting that the agreement had been reached by removing almost all substantive issues concerning the cause of human induced climate change and offers no firms in plans of action. Um, so, basically, it was all talk. It was basically just lip service. There was nothing that was actually going to be properly done. And so an international panel of scientists kind of concluded that it was the proposed framework was not going to limit global warming targets, global warming to the point within the needed targets, I should say. Um, so even if the framework was sufficient for addressing climate change, the actions were not legally required or enforceable. So you pretty much had to have somebody saying in good faith that they were going to continue to do it. However, you have people that decided they didn't want to do it at all, and so you had, for example, President Trump withdrawing the U.S. from the agreement in 2009, which not great when you have the the largest country in the world for pollution deciding that it was going to fall out of the pollution agreement that was being set. And so, with the US departure, that would have left only 9 of the 197 nations that had not formally committed to the agreement. Although President Biden did just quickly reconfirm the US's commitment into doing this work after taking office. But it underscores this tenuous nature of these agreements. It shows that there's not that much putting forward in these agreements, and it's not going to change very much. So it's really not enough to fight climate change because you have to depend on future governments not deciding to upend what has been done before them. Other global responses include the carbon tax, the cap and trade system, and carbon neutrality. So the carbon tax, we've already kind of see this, but businesses are paying a tax on the amount of their carbon emissions from the use of fossil fuels. And so the idea is that economic costs are being involved in paying taxes, and that would motivate people to modify their production processes kind of in order to reduce the emissions and therefore the taxes that they would need to pay. And so many economists agree that a carbon tax would actually be the simplest and most effective way to decrease these emissions. And so in BC, a carbon tax of 10 Canadian dollars per ton was introduced in 2008, and it was at $30 in 2012. Independent studies showed that this tax helped to reduce carbon emissions by 5 to 15%, with the most negligible effects on aggregate economic performance. And so the cost of gasoline increased by 19 cents per gallon. I can't remember what it is per liter, but this is just Ritzer's example, so we're going with gallon. And so heating fuel became more expensive, obviously. We've seen it here. Gas was sitting at 159.9 outside my house yesterday. We all see it. And 10 cents of that at least is the carbon tax on the gas now. And so this obviously leads to things being more expensive, but it also increases incentivized switching to more energy efficient technologies and driving less. So the ideal scheme would be the carbon tax that is set in place so that all nations of the world can participate. And clearly, the effectiveness of the system would be reduced in some areas if the world participated and others did not. So it's helpful for everybody that's participating, but any major polluters like the U.S. and China, those would be helping the most if they were able to jump onto this carbon tax as well. An alternative to the carbon tax is the system of cap and trade, also known as emissions trading. And so in this system, there's a limit placed on the total carbon emissions that are allowed. And the companies buy permits in order to allow them to produce these additional emissions. And so these permits are bought and sold in the marketplace, allowing the market and rather than regulators to set the price of carbon. And according to the logic of the cap and trade system, companies then have an incentive to pollute less. So they have to buy fewer permits. And as a result, the investments are made in better technology are being rewarded economically, perhaps even allowing companies to sell the permits that they no longer need so they can end up making more money on the system. And the system is obviously more complicated than the carbon tax, and it has greater political success. So as of 2020, there are 21 cap and trade systems worldwide that cover more than 42% of the GDP, and it encompasses almost 10% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And one reason for this relative success is that politicians view the cap and trade as more palatable to voters and businesses who now fear taxes. And so most established cap and trade system is in the EU, but when the implementation of China's national programs began in 2021, they became basically the largest carbon trading system in the world. And so there are an additional 24 systems in development or consideration, showing that there's significant expansion of this cap and trade system. Um, Despite the political success of the cap and trade system, the actual workings of these carbon markets have been riddled with problems and are very, very controversial. So, after having a really good start with the European system of the cap and trade, where you had a market value of 15 billion in 2005, it went up to 144 billion in 2009. So, it's making it more expensive to emit greenhouse gases. And so, the prices in the carbon market around the world kind of stagnated for several years because it was so expensive. So after that, trading declined and the prices of carbon emissions dropped, thereby weakening its incentive structure for polluting less. And so the system was hurt by widespread fraud. And so as a result, you had Europe revamping its system in 2015 that decreased the available permits. And environmental groups kind of point to the fact that under the system, companies are still allowed to emit greenhouse gas emissions, and they're not sufficiently incentivized to invest in renewable energy. And so these systems are not nearly as efficient for curbing greenhouse gas emissions that are at rates that are necessary to slow global warming. Um, Nonetheless, these countries, as the world continue to experiment with carbon and taxes and the cap and trade, one of the world's largest polluters, the U.S., still doesn't have a national program for it, and so it's still a problem. The most ambitious goal in cutting emissions would be for a country to go carbon neutral, where their carbon emissions equal zero or is less than the amount of those emissions that are absorbed by the natural environment. In some ways, this is a way that countries can, achieve carbon neutrality, which includes switching to renewable energies, collecting industrial pollutants or methane produced by industrial farming, buying carbon offsets, all of these things. And the difficulty of actually reducing carbon emissions is reflected in the case of Norway, which announced its goal of carbon neutrality in 2008 and has been seen as a leader in the field. So at that time, the Norwegian government set a goal for its carbon neutrality by 2030. But it turns out that these gains were not to be the result of, they're not really reducing carbon emissions in Norway, but by canceling them out by purchasing other carbon offsets. So it works the same way as as trying to offset carbon emissions from a flight, in which you have to purchase land, forest land, or invest in renewable energy in some faraway country. And the offsets are believed to sustainably absorb the carbon emitted from their activities. And so this is this kind of like sleight of hand that's going on. It is allowable under the environmental accounting policy of the UN. So even within its limitations, Norway's methods of dealing with carbon emissions are costly, and very few other nations are actually going to be able to afford it. So more importantly, it's not sustainable, and then since there's not enough trees and plants and clean up all of the factory emissions in the less developed world to kind of compensate for carbon emissions in developed and developing countries. So Norway's had some critics in other countries that are engaging in these practices. They argue that they conceal the fact there is much that needs to be done at home to be able to cut back these carbon emissions. And so Norway has sought to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030. And the central government has, opposed formal commitments and its goals of carbon neutrality, but they haven't been written into law yet. Another way that we can avoid all of this are alternative fuels and power sources. So these are a couple of different power sources that have been brought up in the more recent time. So we've got hybrid technology, ethanol, palm oil, and solar power. So Hybrid technologies like hybrid cars that just kind of derive at least part of their power from electricity. Um, you also have the future of oil dwindling and demand rising, and so a growing concern about global warming that we will see is, there's more efforts to kind of create these alternatives to gasoline powered automobiles, and so cars that plug into the electrical outlet or run entirely on electric power are becoming increasingly available. There's also a growing interest in cutting other alternatives or fuels to gasoline, with great attention focused on ethanol. And the major source of ethanol is corn, especially in the US, but it can be made from other agricultural products. So ethanol can be made from cellulosic sources like switchgrass or wood chips, and Brazilian ethanol made from sugar, which requires less energy than ethanol made from corn. And so ethanol has drawn some more recent attention because it promised to help with the various global problems, including the dependence on oil produced and controlled elsewhere in the world, and also on greenhouse gas emissions. So while it's a third less efficient than gasoline, so ethanol is used up in a less efficient way, it does burn cleaner. And so the expectation placed on the ethanol and other biofuels were so high in the US that the government provided subsidies to spur more ethanol production. And so the Environmental Protection Agency set these quotas on the percentages of ethanol that should be integrated into gasoline, which was extended until this year, 2022. The global problems with ethanol are significant. So, first, the growing interest in ethanol has driven up corn prices, and that also threatens American exports of corn to many parts of the world. Second, it's also a threat in other parts of the world, like Mexico and Guatemala, where there's a great reliance on corn for staple foods. And because of globalization, Mexico has, as we've already talked about this semester, grown already reliant on American corn, and it's therefore directly affected by the increase in price. And furthermore, because there's a global market for corn, the price of Mexican corn has risen as well. So concern has also resurfaced recently that fuels like ethanol might exacerbate the problem of greenhouse gas emissions rather than reduce them. And while biofuels on their own produce fewer emissions than fossil fuels, they cause more when we adopt a broader view. So it has been known for a while that refining these and transporting them and produces more carbon emissions. So, what is new within this realization is that in order to produce these biofuels, rainforests, grasslands, and other natural ecosystems are reduced or destroyed, and that burning or plowing those systems releases greenhouse gases. So, the problem is also exacerbated by these natural ecosystems that act kind of like sponges and absorbing all of the carbon emissions. There's also difficulties in finding alternatives to fossil-based coal and oil sources of energy, and that is manifesting in the case of palm oil. So, not long ago, the Netherlands hit up this idea of using biofuel like palm oil in its electrical plants as a way of moving toward greener, more sustainable energy. And some plants created generators that ran pretty much exclusively on palm oil. And the government provided these massive subsidies and the Netherlands became Europe's leading importer of palm oil. However, you also had the need to provide the Netherlands with palm oil, which led to the decimation of rainforest, more deforestation, and whatnot in places like Indonesia. So you have people that are losing it with their losing out on their rainforests just to be able to produce this on top of it. So to create these new plantations, these lands were drained and burned, leading to massive carbon emissions, which is what the Dutch were trying to reduce in the first place by moving to palm oil. And so was this realization that dawned on some of the broader global areas that viewed on this, whether or not it was required. And so there was a focus on the Netherlands and Europe more generally. And seeing where and why they're ignoring the impact elsewhere in the world when they're making changes in their own backyards. And so these global problems that are resulting from carbon emissions are not solved simply by transferring these emissions from one region to another. We're all on the same earth, we're all having the same problems. So at minimum, to provide a clearer, accounting for all of this, there was some urge that nations like the Netherlands have to take into account all the emissions that result from these changes. So European countries have moved away from from this extensive use of palm oil, and instead the demand has increased elsewhere. So now most of Indonesia's palm oil is exported into markets in other countries like India, China, Pakistan, and Malaysia. One of the better energy sources is solar power. And so one of its attractions is that it produces no greenhouse gases. Especially in warmer climates, it produces the maximum energy just when it's needed. That is, it's producing the most energy on a hot, sunny day. And those are times for the greatest demand for energy to run air conditioners. So some technologies need to use the solar energy and are able to store it, like in batteries or even in molten salt, which is really cool. And so they're able to continue operating at night on cloudy days. And solar power remains more expensive than using fossil fuels, but the difference continues to decrease as demand for energy increases and the supply of fossil fuels decreases, and this cost of solar energy starts declining. One of the countries rapidly expanding its solar energy is Chile. And so, with nearly no fossil fuels of its own, Chile has depended on energy imports from neighboring countries like Argentina. But the sun is so strong in some parts of Chile that the workers at their new solar farms have had to wear protective suits and heavy, heavy layers of sunscreen. So it's pushing itself into renewable resources, which also includes other things in solar power, but also in intensive wind and geothermal energy. So, in contrast from the sources like ethanol and palm oil, we have other things that are, a lower net impact on the environment that we're going to be able to use instead. So, framing these global responses, there are some issues. So, while there's a lot of proposals for combating this climate change and other environmental flows, there are several issues that shape the responses that ultimately end up implemented by governments and nation states. So, this talk of increased use of solar power is related to the growing interest in this technological fix for at least some of the global environmental problems. And there's this longstanding attraction to kind of find more technological solutions to all these social problems. So to many, they're finding new technologies. It seems easier and less painful than the harder task of getting large numbers of people to change longstanding behaviors. And so people don't really want to change their consumption patterns. And so there's this hope that technological fixes in ecological problems that they play a part in are going to be decreased by finding a new technology thing that can fix it. And so you end up getting stuff like geoengineering and a series of relatively new proposals for dealing with the global ecological problems while leaving untouched and unaddressed the underlying and growing causes of global warming. So this is a problem because you're saying, there's a solution here, but we're not going to actually change what we're doing. We're just going to put on this little band-aid here and leave it. And we're not going to touch anything that's underneath the band-aid. We're just going to put the band-aid on and hope for the best. And so this is the scientific support for these possibilities have been muted for a lot of reasons. So there's fear of this talk of solutions would encourage people to continue or if not increase their use of fossil fuels. There's this great fear that people, if some of the proposals do work, then they might have a series of unanticipated consequences that will pose as a greater threat than the problems that are already existing and the problems that they're designed to help with. And then these innovations in geoengineering are they're not set, they're not tried yet, they're very difficult, they're going to be extraordinarily expensive. And so there's other climate related problems like increasing the acidity of oceans that are going to make things more difficult that we're not even going to be touching yet. So there's different sides of each coin there. But the majority of these economic problems are coming with like this high cost of damage as we test all of these things. The possible solutions are going to be very expensive, and there's disagreement across pretty much across the board about how these costs should be shared. Like, do we take it on as North America because we cause the most problems, or is it spread out across everybody else in the world? And there's also people that are opposing all of this environmentalism. And so the people who are in the opposition to environmentalism are, those that are interested in economic development. So we've talked about this already, but people who have, all of their money in things like oil and coal, they're not going to be happy to just give up these fossil fuels because they're already making money off of it. And if they need the Amazon forest to be deforested so that they can, be able to get into all the oil reserves or the gold reserves or whatever reserves are down there, they're going to want to do it regardless. So it's seen itself as a kind of colonialism and perhaps a precursor to the reemergence of a more traditional kind of colonialism, where foreign entrepreneurs are coming in to develop the area for, perhaps preceded by the military. And so, in response to these economic demands, places like Brazil have loosened its protections, and as a result, deforestation has shot up again, and it's increased 30% over the last couple of years. And so there's this thought that we could kind of return to different um, not great ways of living just because of the power relations that are being imposed on those where there's the most impact. There's also quite a few effects on inequality, as we've talked about. So global warming is going to affect everyone, but it's not going to affect everyone equally. We in the global north are contributing more to global warming, but we're going to suffer a lot less. At the individual level, these inequalities are like stark and largely expressed in terms of consumption. We're in a world where people compete on a basis of status, how we consume and how we display our wealth, and that often exhausts tremendous amounts of resources. So we have larger homes, we drive really expensive cars that take up a lot of gas. We have a lot of international travel. We eat a lot of beef. Our consumption choices have, they create and have dramatic environmental impacts, and they're highly uneven in terms. So in general, the wealthy are consuming will consume in a way that is much worse for the environment. But the lifestyles of the richest people in the US tend to generate 10 times more emission than the wealthiest Chinese, for example. And so as climate change worsens, the rich will also be able to shield themselves much more to its effects. And they'll be able to migrate domestically and internationally to cooler climates. And they'll be able to afford the radical surges in food prices. It makes me think of this one YouTube clip of the Ellen Show where Bill Gates is on, and he has to try and say what a bunch of random things from grocery stores are worth. And he thinks that like a box of like rice-a-roni or like hamburger helper or whatever it is was $5 for a box. And everybody in the audience is like, whoa, what are you even talking about? It's obviously $1. He's so far out that he doesn't even know what a basic food item in grocery stores costs. He doesn't do all of that stuff and he doesn't need to worry about it. He literally just walks around and grabs whatever he wants because he's so rich that it's never going to impact him. So it's going to be very obvious to these people that they're going to be able to continue to, take whatever they want and build whatever they want and live wherever they want. Whereas other people that don't have that affluence, they don't have that wealth, they're not going to be able to, hire these armed guards to defend their homes and their wealth from those who don't have any wealth. They're going to be the ones that are trying to, invade other people's houses because they have nothing and they're going to die tomorrow if they don't get the food that they need. And so this dramatic country level and individual level effect are going to have very deep consequences for climate justice. And with activists are arguing this true pronged approach is necessary. So costs have to be borne by the wealthiest countries and individuals, and the inequality itself needs to be addressed before the climate change actually worsens. So, with collapse, there are environmental concerns contributing to societal collapse, and that's not new. Um, in a global age, societies are unlikely to collapse in isolation. We're more likely to collapse altogether. So, what's unique about the global era is the fact that unlike other past societies, where they were not likely to collapse in isolation due to others. So on the one hand, globalization can be a cause of optimism in the sense that other parts of the world will also be alerted to dangers elsewhere long before the dangers are critical to them. And those in the other parts of the world can act to ward off or reduce the problem or to help societies avoid collapse. Um, Global interconnectedness means that kind of these ecological problems in one part of the world are likely to affect others and perhaps the entire planet. So the use of fossil fuels, especially oil, by the U.S. has kind of played this huge role in global warming that is threatening large portions of the globe. And similarly, the emergence of China as an economic superpower has also earned it this dubious position of being the leading contributor to global warming, and therefore making a considerable threat to the ecological world. Um, and so the nature of the problem makes it impossible for this significant ecological problems, including collapse, to be isolated from one locale in the global age. Um, so the time for the world to respond to this disaster is narrowing, and these devastating effects of climate change are already being felt in some parts of the world. And these scenarios in which we make the world uninhabitable are increasing. But most importantly, the world's most authoritative groups, climate scientists, argue that we have approximately 10 years to mount an aggressive global response, or we're going to risk that global society will face irreversible climate catastrophe. So we could also be on, societal collapse on a global scale. Um, but there are things that can be done. Global response can fix things to some extent. So hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll get there. Um, as always, here's your summary slide. I'll let you read it. I've talked plenty today. Um, this week, we have the second discussion question due on March 7th at 11:59 p.m. on Blackboard. Please review the requirements on the assignment tab on Blackboard and get that in. Yeah, hopefully you're all okay. Don't take all of this too harshly. No existential crises coming from this class, please. But we do have to, as adults, recognize that we have to, take part in all of this as well. So hopefully it's opened your eyes to some of the important impacts of climate change on the global scale, and hopefully you found it somewhat interesting. And I'll catch you next week.